wildfires aren't just destructive, they're actually a key natural process that shape how forests grow and change. And but here's the thing, that their effects are complex, and that's what makes them so fascinating to study. Now let's think about what happens after a fire. Variability in post-fire regeneration. What does this mean? One of the most interesting things is how differently areas recover after wildfires. Some places bounce back quickly with dense forest, while others transitions into grasslands or shrubs. So what does this mean? This is the second point. And finally, after decades of research, there's still a lot we don't fully understand about how forests respond to fires. For example, how do factors like fire intensity, drought, or human activity interact to reshape forest compositions? So these are the three key points that I would like to emphasize in next slides. Forest resilience and state transition. This is a very simple photo of resilience. And when we think about resilience, it is important to take a moment and rethink how we define it. Because resilience isn't just about bouncing back to the way things were before, like this estate. Imagine this is the system or the forest, and we're talking about this estate. So resilience isn't just about bouncing back to the way things were before. It's really about adapting to new conditions like this one, passing the tipping points. And so it's about adapting to new conditions while still keeping the ecosystem healthy and functional. And this helps ecosystems survive. And talking about post-fire transitions are such a great way to study resilience. What I mean by this is that they let us see whether forests can hold on to their original identity here after a disturbance, or if they shift into completely new ecological paths. And these transitions tell us so much about the long-term effects of fire and how ecosystems are adapting. And this leads us to a really important question here for forest management. Are we actually creating healthy, adaptable landscape by always trying to restore things to how they were before the disturbance? Okay, so traditional approach. Traditionally, forest management has been guided by a pretty straightforward idea. Replant what was harvested. And the thinking was that tree communities would naturally return to their original state within a few decades. It's kind of like saying plant what you cut, but it tends to oversimplify the complexity of forest ecosystems. What we've come to realize is that forest recovery, or what we call successional pathway, isn't as simple or predictable as we once thought. They are not linear. They can vary a lot depending on natural patterns, the severity of disturbance, and increasingly the impact of climate change. So here's the big question. Should we move away from traditional replant what you call model and shift to something more adaptive, like restore what is sustainable? So this kind of change would mean acknowledging the natural variability in recovering, and also focusing on creating landscape that aren't just restored. Let's take a closer look at the objectives of this study. Number one, I would like to start with a question. Are we starting to see new unexpected patterns? So, objective one, our main objective is to look at post-fire vegetation transitions. We're trying to figure it out if these transitions match up with what we've traditionally expected from forest regeneration. In simple terms, what I described in previous slides, are forests bouncing back the way we've always thought they would? Or the question that I started this objective, are we starting to see new unexpected patterns? Second, evaluate the compositional stability of boreal forests in response to disturbances. So we are asking, are these ecosystems holding on to their essential functions and recovering well, or are they beginning to shift into entirely new state because of things like disturbances and climate change? And objective number three, finally, our third objective is about understanding what all this means for sustainable forest management and policy. How can we take these insights and use them to create strategies that are sustainable? So together, these objectives help us get a clear picture of how boreal forests respond to fire, and they are paving the way for smarter, more effective forest management strategies moving forward. Okay, this is the research approach. It's simple. We have study goals, methodology, impacts, and application. Study goal is to understand post-fire vegetation transitions and evaluate resilience in boreal forest. For the methodology, we use GIS Pro and NMDS in RStudio and other statistical methods in RStudio. And the impacts and application will be linked findings to forest policy implications on under evolving environmental conditions. So after seeing research approach, I would like to talk about more about the questions this study set out to answer and the practical steps we've developed based on what we found. So here we have two questions. The first big question is whether traditional replanting practices like the plant what you got that I already explained in previous slides actually align with how forests naturally regenerate after disturbances. Does this method really reflect what happens in nature? And even more importantly, question number two, should we update forest management policies to support transition that build resilience instead of trying to force forests back to exactly how they were before? And based on what we've learned, here are two key actions we're recommending. First, it's time to shift toward more adaptive strategies that recognize the natural complexity and variability of how forests recover. And second, or number two here, we need to incorporate these insights into long-term management plans. It's not just about making forests healthy today. It's about ensuring they're functional and ready to face future disturbances. Okay, this is a map of our case study area. This study focuses on 39 wildfires that occurred in Alberta between 1956 and 2004. And by using data from the Alberta Vegetation Inventory, or AVI, we've been able to track how forest composition and structure have changed over time. And these fires are part of the Healthy Landscape Program, the data collected between 1998 and 2007. And there's something important here to highlight. This data set has already made a big impact on research. It's been used in 8 other studies, as has involved several postdocs and graduate students. And I would like to mention here that what we're doing now builds on that foundation. We are adding fresh insights that could make forest management even more sustainable in future. For the methodology with GIS, we used overlay techniques in GIS Pro to detect the exact areas where generation shift is. And this gave us clear measurements of how these changes spread across the landscape. And a big part of this process was making sure that our data followed AVI standards. I'm talking about the pre-fire AVI, because we wanted to keep our analysis consistent and accurate, especially when working with aerial photos for the pre-fire data sets. And what's really powerful about this method is that it doesn't just show the landscape before and after the fire. Later, we use this data in RStudio, revealing change in the structure and composition by coding in R. So this provides a basis for understanding broader patterns across the study area. Okay, so I talked about the pre-fire dataset and the post-fire dataset in this slide. Now here we take a closer look at how stand types were distributed before and after the Alger fire as an example. The Alger fire happened in 1971, so the pre-fire photo is for 1971, and the post-fire datasets belong to 2017. Starting with the top map, which shows the pre-fire landscape in 1971, we can see a diverse mix of forest types, and each color represents a different stand types, which are available here in our legend. And now shifting to the post-fire map from 2017, we can see how things evolved over time. And I know it's difficult to see in the screen. That's why on the right side, we've zoomed in on a specific section to focus on this transition in greater detail. So we can compare, for example, here you see the huge patch of pure black spruce in green in 1971. And when the fire happened, approximately 46 years later, you see the patches of pure pine here and also herbaceous grasslands on the both sides. So overall, these maps provide a visual summary of how the landscape transformed and how fire shaped both the composition and spatial patterns of the forest. Okay, let's take a look at this bar chart. It's focused on 4 key stand types to give us a better idea of how their total areas have changed, decreased, stayed the same before and after the fire. So the green bars here represent the pre-fire area, and the orange bars shows the post-fire area for each stand types. And we have pure black spruce here, pure pine, pure larch, and pure white spruce. Seeing them, I think seeing them side by side makes it super easy to compare and spot how much each type has shifted over time. So for example, speaking of pure black spruce here, we can see an increase in area after the fire. But if you look at pure pine or pure larch, the responses are a bit different. Some are more stable, while others shows varying levels of decline. So it really highlights how each type reacts differently to disturbance. Okay, this was an example. Now, this chart gives us a complete view of all the stand types in the study area, showing how their total area changed before and after the fire, from pure black spruce pine, larch to birch, open shrubs, and mixedwood. Again, the same as the previous slide, you can see the green bars represent the pre-fire area and the orange bars show the post-fire area for each stand type. And this broader perspective let us look at the changes across the entire landscape. Pure black spruce, pure pine are still the dominant stand types in terms of the total area. And what's great about this big picture view is that it helps us understand how the fire impacted the overall spatial distribution of stand types across the study area that I will explain more in next slides. So again, here, I would like to emphasize that our analysis make it clear that forest transitions after wildfires are anything but simple. They're incredibly dynamic. Some species increase, others decline, and some stay pretty stable over time. But what's really fascinating is how these findings challenge traditional management practices that I mentioned in first slides, like the old replant what you cut approach. The method assumes recovery will be predictable, but the data here clearly shows that the natural regeneration doesn't always work that way. So the big takeaway here, what is it? It is that we need to move toward more adaptive strategies in forest management, strategies that actually reflect what we are seeing on the ground in real world. It seems a little bit complicated, but let's start with a simplified example to get a clear idea of what we're working with. This is the heat map. And in this transition matrix, the diagonal cells, what I mean by diagonal cells, I mean these boxes, green boxes with black border. The diagonal cells are where we see that pre-fire stand type, type A to type A. This is the pre-fire, and here is the post-fire. So the diagonal cells are where we see the pre-fire stand types stayed the same after the fire. In other words, the ecosystem managed to recover its original composition, which is a strong sign of stability. But now let's move to off-diagonal cells, the red ones. That's where things get more interesting. This presents the dynamic transitions. For example, type B from type A to type B is 10%. So it is where the ecosystem shifted to a completely different stand type after the fire. So do you remember the second point I mentioned in the first slide? It shows the natural variability of forests and how they adapt to disturbances. And With that basic understanding in mind, we can now move on to the real data and explore the real data and how these patterns actually play out across the study area. This heat map shows us the trends we observed across all 39 fires in this study, and each cell represents a transition between the pre-fire here and the post-fire. So the pre-fire is listed on the left, and the post-fire is along the bottom. I don't know if you see my mouse. And inside each cell, you can see the proportion of each transition. What I mean by that is from pure pine to pure pine is 48.3. Again, diagonal cells, the black borders, green ones. These represent cases where the same stand type was retained after the fire, places where ecosystems were able to maintain their original composition. For example, pure black spruce to pure black spruce, 46.6%, or what I mentioned for pure pine. Then again, we have the off-diagonal cells, which show the more dynamic shifts where stand types change to something completely different. Again, from pure black spruce to pure pine, it's 22.7%. So I give you 20 seconds to look at this heat map because it is interesting. This heat map shows a clear picture of how wildfire affects a stand type's composition. And it gives us valuable insights into different ways forests recover after the fire. Okay, now talking about pure black spruce. Based on the results that I showed you, pure black spruce shows really stability in its composition, meaning it managed to hold on to a lot of its original characteristics after the disturbance. Second, it expanded significantly into areas that were previously occupied by other forest types. This kind of special growth is a clear sign of adaptability. And speaking of adaptability, this stand type also demonstrates a remarkable ability to take over new areas after the fire, which is impressive, I think. And finally, it became a dominant species in the post-fire landscape. Pure black spruce, while this dominance is a strength, it also leads to a more homogeneous forest, uniform forest structure, which has its own set of implications for biodiversity. But altogether, about pure black spruce, this stand type plays a major role in shaping the forest recovery. And now talking about pure pine. First, it experienced moderate changes in its composition. So it means that while there was some transition, it is still retained a fair amount of its original characteristics. I don't know if you remember 48.8% that I mentioned in the heat map. And second, expanded significantly into neighboring areas like pine-dominated zones. This shows its adaptability and ability to occupy new ecological spaces. And finally, in the post-fire landscape, it ranks second in total area after pure black spruce, so it has a capacity for expansion. And now talking about pure aspen. I didn't talk about our coding in R, but pure aspen is important here because it shows significant results while we were analyzing the codes in R, and also is a deciduous example for this webinar. So let's take a closer look at this stand type and how it responds after the fire. First, it experienced minimal change in its structure, showing a lot of stability in its composition. And second, smaller presence in the landscape compared to more expansive forest types. So this is the second, and also, while its composition remained stable, it didn't have a lot of influence on shaping the overall forest dynamics. And lastly, this is important. It seems to give way to more dominant species like pure black spruce or pine-dominated types, which took over larger areas of the post-fire landscape. So let's have a summary of these three types that I talked. Starting with pure black spruce. Pure black spruce. It has a balance between stability and spatial dominance. It keeps its composition while also expanding significantly. Black spruce is a dominant player in post-fire landscape in our case study area, and its resilience stands out in both its ability to hold its ground and its capacity for compete for space. Then going to pure pine. Pure pine also maintains compositional stability, but undergoes more noticeable structural changes after the fire. So it proves to be a strong spatial competitor, expanding into new areas and playing a significant role in shaping the fire structures. So we have two things here, and also it maintains compositional stability, but it proves to be a strong spatial competitor. And finally, we have pure aspen that it shows the highest compositional stability that I mentioned. I haven't talked about those codes here in this webinar, meaning it retains its structure with minimal changes after the fire, but has a smaller post-fire footprint. What does this mean? It means that its spatial inference across the landscape is more limited. So these comparisons show how each stand type used different strategies to adapt to fire with varying levels of stability and spatial influence that together shape the post-fire ecosystems. Okay, as we look ahead, the patterns we've seen give us important clues about shaping post-fire forests. One key point is that forests recover differently. Some species remain stable, others change a lot, and this affects the whole recovery process. And the point that I started my webinar with. And talking about species like black spruce and pine, yes, they adapt well to fires, which is great, but their dominance can reduce biodiversity and making the landscape more uniform, more homogeneous, which is an ideal for long-term ecosystem health, probably. And the main takeaway here is we need to balance resilience and diversity. Both are essential for keeping forests healthy and functional. And ultimately, by understanding how species adapt and grow back, we can ensure forests are both resilient and diverse for the future. So what's next? Future research. We'll explore how climate and weather affect post-fire forest recovery. These are key factors in how forests bounce back and stay resilient, helping us improve our strategies. So using these insights, we can adapt our forest management to work better with changing environment, keeping practices effective and sustainable. So this isn't just about understanding post-fire changes. It's about giving practical tools to manage forests in a world where climate change is a growing challenge.